Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second session of today's conference. My name is Biskupski. I'm from Central Connecticut State University. Our session will be devoted to the foreign policy and its problems of the Polish Second Republic. We have three speakers who, lucky for me, need no introduction. We'll be speaking in chronological order. Our first speaker is Piotr Wandyć from Yale University, emeritus, former Bradford Durfee Professor of History, now emeritus. He will be followed, dealing with the 1930s, by Professor Marek Kornat from the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, and dealing with the period of the Second World War, Professor Anna Cienciała of University of Kansas, emerita. I will conclude that with making a few comments, and then we'll throw open the floor for questions. So without further ado, I will now introduce Professor Piotr Wandyć.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is this working well? Do you hear me, or should I get to the point?
Just a little closer.
A little closer. All right.
Thank you for our seniors.
I can sympathize with that. Ladies and gentlemen, the year 1921 may be considered as marking the real beginnings of peacetime foreign policy of the Second Polish Republic. During the preceding 3 years, Poland, reborn after more than a century of partitions, fought for its frontiers by arms as well as by diplomacy. It clashed with Germany, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, and waged war against the Bolsheviks. By 1921, the situation became stabilized domestically and externally. In March, the parliament adopted a constitution, and Poland signed the Treaty of Riga, which put an end to the war in the east. The grandiose so-called federalist plan of Piłsudski had to be abandoned. Following 3 uprisings in Upper Silesia and the plebiscite, a final division of the area took place. A border was also drawn after a plebiscite in southern East Prussia. This completed the work on the determination of the German-Polish border. An accord intervened, dividing the Duchy of Cieszyn. Polish expectations, however, were not fully met. The long eastern frontier was not recognized by the great powers, which meant also that some uncertainty remained about the status of eastern Galicia and the border with Lithuania. Germany had not renounced revisionism, and Soviet Russia did not abandon its final goal of world revolution. Placed between these two inimical, albeit weakened powers, Poland had to search for security. What were the options? The advice given occasionally to the Poles that they should rely on Germany against Russia, or vice versa, was totally impractical. A rapprochement with Berlin was possible only at the price of border revisions. Coming closer to Soviet Russia, still unrecognized by the great powers, would isolate Poland internationally and place it at the mercy of Moscow. In case of a German-Soviet war, Poland would become a battleground. Fully aware of these dangers, Warsaw needed allies. And indeed, in 1921, it signed alliance treaties with France and Romania and made efforts to come closer to Czechoslovakia through the Skiermont-Beneš Pact. Attempts were also made to promote a wider system of cooperation among the states of East Central Europe. Yet, a purely defensive or foreign policy with a strong military component was not sufficient in itself, and a new approach had to be adopted. What would it be, and how was such a policy to be formulated and adopted? 2 documents throw some light on this question. In August 1921, Foreign Minister Konstanty Skiermont sent his well-known circular instruction based on the assumption that Poland must overcome the distrust of its policies which prevailed in the West. It was widely believed there that Poland was guilty of imperialism in the East and was aggressive vis-à-vis other neighbors. Marshal Piłsudski was deemed unpredictable. It was important to change this negative image. Skiermont's program stressed respect for international treaties, cooperation with smaller neighbors, and peaceful relations with Germany and the Soviet Union. Given the exposed position of Poland and the threats coming from east and west, Steelmans wrote that Poland needed above all peace in order to stabilize and develop the young state. Its future could only be assured by the maintenance of the existing balance of power based on the common interest of all the victor states of World War I. The second document, adopted by the Council of Ministers in January 1921, had been prepared by the General Staff and entitled Foreign Policy from the Viewpoint of the Security of the State. A Polish historian described it as, quote, a dogma of political thinking of the leading circles of the Second Republic. According to it, the principal goal of Poland was to maintain peace and territorial status quo. It assumed that if Poland was attacked by Germany, Warsaw could rely on France, although the possibility of an evolution of French attitude toward Berlin could not be ruled out. French assistance in case of a Soviet attack was deemed more problematic. Hence, the General Staff insisted on clarification of the provisions of the military convention with France and recommended the conclusion of alliances in East Central Europe. The above ideas and principles were to be elaborated and put on a firm ideological, I would not hesitate to say philosophical, foundation by Alexander Skrzynski. Arguably the most important foreign minister of interwar Poland, Skrzynski directed the country's policy from December 22 to May 23 and from July 24 to May 26. While Skrzynski's talents were not questioned, his diplomacy was often subjected to criticism, and his complex personality did not always gain in friends. Skrzynski developed his ideas in numerous speeches to the Sejm, Senate, Foreign Affairs Committee, in lectures given at home and abroad, in interviews, articles, and finally, not in the sense at last, but he wrote it much earlier, in a book entitled Poland in Peace. Whether in or out of office, he exposed his views with a rare consistency and sought to apply them to diplomatic practice. Skrzynski always placed Polish goals and interests in a wider context. He criticized the parochialism of his countrymen, their national egoism, and the inability to understand how the country was perceived from abroad. He was convinced that one had to follow, understand, and analyze the great international currents which Poland could only oppose at its own peril. In that, it is likely that he was influenced by the Krakow historical school, according to which Poland's partitions were largely due to the fact that Poland fell out of step with the general evolution of Europe. In his book, Skrzynski presented a survey of the 19th century system, which worked, as he put it, well at first, but it carried the seeds of its own destruction. World War I destroyed it, and on its ruins arose the new Europe, founded on the victory of nationality and democracy, and marking a new phase in the development of humanity. Although Wilson's ideology did not fully triumph at the Paris Peace Conference, in the sense of assuring peace in Europe, it engendered the League of Nations, quote, a new holy alliance concluded for the freedom of nations, a great moral achievement of the suffering humanity, and a great political experiment. True, Skrzynski argued, the League was a tribunal without means of enforcing its verdicts, a conference without effective power. The League could not prevent war, but it could prevent a victorious end of the war that defied the feeling of justice. As an example of this point, Skrzynski mentioned the popular reaction during World War I, which overthrew 3 monarchies. Above all, Skrzynski argued one had to avoid war. Having fought himself in the World War I, Skrzynski was appalled by the senseless waste and carnage, and he predicted that unless a policy of enforcing peace prevailed, a second, even more devastating war would be inevitable. Peace had to be won through constant struggle, which demanded the strengthening of the League of Nations. Rejecting the accusation of being an impractical idealist, Skrzynski declared himself an optimist and realist. As he put it, quote, "Realism of tomorrow is nothing else than the ideology of today," end of quote. And he quoted a saying of Machiavelli that it is a good policy to do today what one will be forced to do tomorrow. What did all this mean for Poland? Skrzynski declared that the rebirth of Poland was not fortuitous, but it was a necessary result of both the logic and nature of new international relations. The link between Poland and the League was obvious. The covenant he described as, quote, "an act of Poland's rebirth," unquote. There was no contradiction between the International League and the national state, and Skrzynski, not surprisingly, condemned integral nationalism. Nor did he see a contradiction between the policy of peace and the maintenance of a strong army, which in Poland's case would not be a manifestation of militarism. True, even the largest Polish army could not defeat either of its two giant neighbors, but it could increase the risk they would incur when attacking this country. Thus, Polish foreign policy must rely first on the League and second on alliances, for he considered a fundamental error to put all trust in alliances and treat the League as an impediment to diplomacy. Since Poland emerged out of the peace treaties, they were naturally the basis and the starting point of Polish foreign policy. The maintenance and execution of these treaties in the spirit of international solidarity was, as he put it, a categorical imperative. Foreign policy he defined, quote, as a synthesis of all basic interests of the state, legal, political, material, and moral, real and ideal, end of quote. It was not a mosaic of interests and litigations, quote, which any given foreign minister dealt with as a fortuitous advocate. The task of foreign policy was to create a great synthesis of political thought, which in the long run would gain international respect. In a major speech, Skrzynski declared that he never felt more in agreement with the great laws governing international relations than when he tried to understand and reconcile them with the constant, permanent, and unchangeable rules of Polish foreign policy. Before we look at the application of these lofty principles in practice, let us consider Skrzynski's views on the major European powers. Although he continued the policy of cooperation with France, he attached great importance to Britain, which he tried to bring closer to Poland. Unlike some other Polish diplomats, he did not fear a Franco-British rapprochement. On the contrary, he favored it because British involvement could strengthen the cause of peace and security in Europe. Trying to project an image of Polish diplomacy as cooperative and reasonable, he was willing to make minor concessions to Germany. For instance, with regard to German national minority in Poland, which Berlin used for revisionist purposes. But he firmly defended Poland's territorial integrity. He was willing to discuss cooperation, even a non-aggression treaty with the USSR, but not at the expense of other states in East Central Europe. Last but not least, he attached greater importance than many of his compatriots to the United States because of its financial power. Among the issues and challenges which Skrzynski faced, three were of particular importance: Polish eastern borders, the Geneva Protocol, and the Pact of Locarno. In 1923, French and Belgian troops entered the Ruhr as reprisals for German default on reparations. Simultaneously, the Lithuanians seized Klaipėda in defiance of the peace settlement. Skrzynski adopted a policy of restraint vis-à-vis the Ruhr affair, which had very dangerous international repercussions, and he chose very peaceful means to denounce the Lithuanian move. He cleverly exploited the fact that the French needed Poland and emphasized that his concern was the defense of the inviolability of treaties. He insisted that the non-recognition of Polish eastern borders posed a threat to peace and stability. Although Skrzyński critics wanted him to be more forceful and derided his idealistic pronouncement, he achieved his goal when in April 1923, the Conference of Ambassadors recognized Polish frontiers as established by the Treaty of Riga. The second challenge came in 1924 when, in order to strengthen the League of Nations, British and French Prime Ministers MacDonald and Herriot launched the so-called Geneva Protocol based on arbitration, security, and disarmament. Skrzyński regarded it as the optimal solution of the problem of security, and in case in which European evolution coincided with Polish interests. Again, he was subject to criticism by the Polish army, especially General Sikorski, who argued that only French military commitments to Poland would bring real security to the country. Eventually, the protocol was rejected by a new British cabinet, a fact which Skrzyński never ceased to deplore. The third and most serious challenge came when Germany, encouraged by Britain, proposed a new security scheme. It was to consist of a Western pact stabilizing German-French-Belgian border with Britain as guarantor. As for Germany's eastern neighbors, Berlin would consent only to an arbitration treaty. This created a dilemma for Paris and Warsaw, which maintained that the security on the Rhine had to be accompanied by security on the Vistula. Polish diplomacy had the following options: abstain and take a negative stand aiming at the prevention of the accords, or seek to participate in the negotiations to safeguard as possible Poland's interests. The first option carried the risk of making the French regard the Poles as an obstacle to a British guarantee which Paris desired, and the French-Polish alliance as a liability. Hence, Skrzyński decided to engage in complex negotiations, trying to propose parallel security pacts in the West and the East, and later, as an alternative, a French and hopefully British guarantee of the German-Polish arbitration treaty. His efforts included even a journey to the United States, where he pleaded in vain for American support. Eventually, Skrzyński was invited to join the powers meeting in Locarno, but could participate only in the drafting of the German-Polish arbitration treaty, although he was one of the signatories, but that was pro forma of the final protocol. He had to be satisfied with obtaining some concessions: a new Franco-Polish Treaty of Guarantee, which was signed in Locarno, which was somewhat equivocal in the provisions of French aid to Poland. Its real value depended, however, as one of the Polish military leaders put it, not on the wording of the text, but on the will to execute it. Locarno was denounced in Poland as a major defeat, and Skrzyński was sharply criticized for signing it. His policy of multilateralism was contrasted with the bilateral approach of Sikorski and others who believed that a determined Polish opposition would not have allowed France to sign Locarno. Defending his policy, Skrzyński believed that he had achieved all that was possible. Locarno diminished somewhat German revisionism and adjusted the French alliance to new conditions. It improved the image of Poland, London, and Paris as a reasonable and cooperative country. And, above all, it meant Britain's association with international security, again both for Europe and for Poland. The alternative would have been complete isolation. Time limitation does not permit the discussion of subsequent moves by Skrzyński, namely efforts to obtain for Poland a permanent seat of the Council of the League. A semi-permanent seat was achieved by his successor Zaleski, and to persuade Czechoslovakia to form a Central European bloc.
Runded for those remarks emphasizing the role of Mr. Skrzyński, somewhat perhaps less appreciated in the West than he should be, but also a Polish foreign minister operating in rather happier circumstances than some of his subsequent colleagues. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to Professor Marek Kornat. Mr. Kornat, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, I will speak about Polish policy of balance and Polish bilateralism. Although a lot has been written about pre-war Polish foreign policy, there are still many matters which arouse discussion. Was the policy conducted by Piłsudski and Beck condemned to failure? Was there any political alternative to this conception? What conclusions can be drawn from this policy? What part of the lesson learned by interwar Poland remains topical today, 70 years later? How did Beck understand the position of Poland in Europe? It is unquestionable that he influenced the way Poland was perceived in the world. And as Professor Wandrich observed, the personality of Beck played a certain role in the attitude of the West to Poland. The time that has elapsed since the dramatic events of 30 years and the end of the Second World War let us view this person more from a distance, in a more objective and deeper way than it has been possible so far. After the seizing of power in 1926, Marshal Piłsudski came to the conclusion that the foreign policy of Poland should be based on two canons, two fundamental principles. Firstly, it should maintain the alliances with France and Romania, and secondly, it should strive for the improvement of relations with her both big neighbors. These two assumptions did not lose their validity till the end of the Second Republic of Poland. However, policy conducted by August Zaleski during his ministerial cadency was more moderate and accommodant than that in days of Józef Beck. However, it must be observed that Zaleski worked in times of peaceful stabilization of Europe in the Locarno period, post-Locarno period. Today, many historians criticize the Polish policy toward France after 1934, blaming Piłsudski and Beck for weakening this alliance. However, Polish statesmen were right and logical for striving for a certain independence from France, since, as Henry Kissinger rightly observed, a power which is absolutely committed has no negotiating position. Since the Locarno agreements, the Polish-French alliance was systematically growing weaker. Polish-French divergences arose above all from the fact that the alliance with France was for the Poles a guarantee in case of war, while for the French it was an instrument in their political game for the organization of peace in post-war Europe. Piłsudski and Beck considered the agreement with the Germans reached in January 1934 as the greatest achievement of Polish diplomacy. Piłsudski, toward the end of his life, managed to achieve a considerable stabilization of international situation of Poland. The declaration of non-aggression with Reich from January 1934 and the non-aggression treaty with the Soviet Union concluded in July 1932 was created the basis of Polish foreign policy in 30 years. The simultaneous rapid deterioration of German-Soviet relations after Hitler came to power opened new possibilities before Polish diplomacy. The Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia were divided in their antagonistic ideologies. This allowed Poland to conduct a policy independent both of Berlin and Moscow. Polish-German declaration of non-aggression brought Poland some essential but short-lived benefits, among them greater security and the improvement of its relations in the international arena. Poland gained a possibility to conduct a more independent policy both towards the Western powers and possibility of more effective policy in Central Eastern Europe. It has also freed itself of its unilateral dependence on the French ally. In Germany, Poland lost its connotation of a seasonal state. It had according to anti-Polish propaganda in Weimar times. Possibilities opened to strengthen the position of Poland in Central Eastern Europe tried to be used by Polish leadership. Poland achieved the postponement of the German territorial claims, but was not able to avoid the weakening of the alliance with France. Although Poland, while coming to terms with the Third Reich, never intended to drop its alliance with France, its disintegration became unavoidable under the circumstances of 30 years. In January 1934, agreement with Germany determined the lack of Warsaw's interest in the various projects of collective security and negotiations of the Eastern Locarno, since the Polish government valued more the bilateral agreement with Germany than multilateral ones. The fact of conducting an independent policy raised Poland's prestige, which was not negligible for Piłsudski and Beck. At the same time, no system of collective security in Europe was imaginable without the participation of Poland. Polish government expected that its agreement with the Germans would guarantee Poland's security, and on the other hand, for Hitler, the normalization of relations with Poland was only the point of departure to his broader plans. Hitler wanted to involve Poland in their common fight against Soviet Russia, while Poland wanted to conduct an independent policy. The Chancellor saw Poland as an important element of the system of the alliances of Third Reich. He planned to tolerate the Polish policy of balance only for a certain time. Thus, the declaration of January 1934 was only a provisional arrangement without a chance for survival. One cannot deny that peaceful relations between Poland and Germany were an essential guarantee of the preservation of equilibrium in Central Eastern Europe. Polish leadership attached great importance to maintain good relations with Germany. However, it was only the normalization of Polish-German relations that protected Poland from the catastrophe of German-Soviet cooperation. It must be added that the Soviet leaders were always open to deal with Germany against Poland in this time. But Hitler was not interested in such a combination. The general climate of Poland's relation with Hitler's Germany, which tried to include Poland in the orbit of its influence, was better than than in the Polish-Soviet relations. The later, however officially normalized, were more and more submerged to a Cold War in the end of 30 years. Until the spring of 1939, however, Poland had maintained the principles of balance and did not let to incur any obligations toward one of its big neighbors that would direct it against the other. The possibility, the policy of balance that Beck tried to conduct was not his own idea, as it is sometimes wrongly claimed in historiography. This was the conception of Marshal Piłsudski, which was a logical consequence of the realities of Polish history and political geography in Eastern Europe. It was impossible to make an agreement with Germany against Russia, or vice versa, and Poland would achieve nothing by such a policy. It also should be added that no serious Polish politician did formulate a conception of an alliance with Germany or a rapprochement on cooperation with Soviet Russia. The bilateralism of international agreements, non-ideological understanding of foreign policy and attachment to cabinet diplomacy were the main ideas of Joseph Beck. The bilateralism preferred by Beck included not so much resistance to any multilateral agreements, but above all the aversion to pactomania, so characteristic in the diplomacy of 30 years. Both Piłsudski and Beck thought that talks had to be conducted with the existing German and Soviet governments, regardless of its internal policy. They had, in this method, by presenting this method, a non-ideological conception of foreign policy. Piłsudski and Beck preferred the method of concrete and precise bilateral agreements to the nebulous principles of collective security, which diluted the actual obligations. They combined these convictions with the distance and critical attitude toward the League of Nations, which in their eyes was ineffective. Beck's policy toward Czechoslovakia and the ultimatum about the revindication of the territory beyond the Olza River of 30th September 1938 is considered to be the great error of his policy. Indeed, this move contributed to the creation of a very bad climate around Poland in Europe. There was an impression that Poland the Polish moves toward Czechoslovakia were coordinated with Germany. We should, however, see here the arguments of one of the architects of Polish foreign policy of this time, which was Polish ambassador to London, Edward Raczyński, who, being by no means one of Beck's men, was very loyal and critical sometimes of him. Raczyński said, I'm sitting, I had an impression that we were in a blind alley since we attacked the Czechs, demanded equality of rights to Polish minority in Czechoslovakia, while Munich created a situation where we could either admit that we had suffered a complete defeat, or we could ask Hitler to give us a part of Bohemia. For this reason, I was rather relieved by the Polish ultimatum to Czechoslovakia, for it liberated us from the awkward situation where, going hand in with the Germans, we found ourselves empty-handed while they took everything. This feeling, of course, didn't undermine my conviction that, logically speaking, Munich was our defeat, while the annexation of the territory beyond the Olza River was a desperate attempt to get out of this situation. Finish of the end of the citation. The policy of appeasement conducted by the Western powers placed Poland in a very difficult situation. The establishment of the Quartet of the Great Powers as an organ competent to carry out the change of borders in Europe led to the marginalization of Poland in the international arena and turned it into an object in the relations between those powers. Therefore, Beck's attitude to the Western powers in the second half of 30 years was marked by a principle of limited trust. This was fully realized by the British ambassador to Warsaw, Sir Howard Kennard, who in March 1939, in one of his reports, wrote to Lord Halifax that Beck based his policy on the conviction that neither the British nor the French governments would be prepared in case of need to offer effective assistance to Poland in her effort to resist the further expansive moves of Germany in Central Europe. Together with the Munich Conference in autumn 1938, all the previous reasons for conducting the balanced policy collapsed. This was the end of the very fragile stabilization achieved in East Central Europe, on which Beck based his calculations and actions. Marshal Piłsudski forecast of March 1934, saying that the current state of correct relations with Germany and Russia could survive no more than 4 years, came true. This is a view in historiography that while Marshal Piłsudski understood the normalization of relations with both neighboring powers as transitory, Beck believed that this provisional state will be a natural way turn into a permanent arrangement. This is the observation of Stanisław Żelko, the author of a book about Polish-German relations in 30 years. This is true, but nevertheless, this was a matter of secondary importance, in my opinion. In fact, in the conditions of the growing tendency to appeasement, Minister Beck had no alternative to his policy of maintaining good relations with the Germans, as long as this could be reconciled with the indispensable principle of preserving the independence of Poland. We have to emphasize it again. The rapprochement with Germany was possible only to a certain rational point. This point, which Poland could not let go beyond, was the independence and territorial integrity of the Polish state. Therefore, Beck didn't hesitate to reject Hitler's demands for the return of the free city of Gdańsk to the German right and for the exterritorial highway and railroad across Polish Pomerania. The acceptance of these demands would probably allow Poland to avoid the scenario which Poland experienced in 1939, but this would mean that Poland would become a vassal of Germany. The claims of the leader of Third Reich were unacceptable, not because they would undermine the prestige of Poland, as some historians contend, but their rejection was not caused by the pressure of Polish public opinion, but resulted from Pope Beck's and Polish leadership's firm conviction that they could not be reconciled with the most vital interests of Poland. What decided the fate of Poland in 1939 was the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. Polish leadership didn't perceive the danger of Berlin-Moscow rapprochement, although it seemed to be real and imminent through the world history of pre-war Europe. It is well-known observation of August 28, in which Minister Beck described Poland's situation was as not too bad. Why did he evaluate Poland's position so mistakenly? I think that in the first place, what dominated in the Polish foreign ministry was the conviction that the guarantees would turn any Polish-German conflict into an international affair, which would make the Soviet Union retain its neutrality. And in the first stage of European war, Beck didn't expect Soviet Russia to attack Poland. However, he was convinced about Russia's bad will. I will recall the observations of Ambassador Raczyński once again. These observations are in his report to Beck from August 24. This agreement protects the Soviet, said Ambassador Raczyński, and this agreement, Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, is a guarantee of doubtless benefits to them, whether in any case of international conference or a localized war. On the other hand, in the case of total war, which apart from Poland would involve its Western allies, the Soviet would be interested in retaining their neutrality, and it is unimaginable that would want to help the Germans. The end of citation. It seems that Beck was of similar opinion as the ambassador to London. Besides, Raczyński rightly supposed that the Soviet Russia was trying, with the consent of London and Paris, to take control of Polish territories, which finally, in simultaneous negotiations in summer 1939, Hitler ceded to the Soviet Union. While analyzing these matters, let us remember that the Western powers, in the first place, the governments of France and the United States, did not inform the Polish authorities of the content of the secret clauses to the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, although credible news of these events reached them. In the face of Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, no Polish foreign policy could save the independence of the state or even partly modify the scenario established in Moscow and Berlin. The scenario of the division of the region of Europe into the spheres of interest of both totalitarian powers. Beck's scheme was left with no field for maneuver, unless we see capitulation as an alternative. In the light of the hitherto knowledge, it is beyond any question that even if Minister Beck had known of the secret clauses of the Soviet-German non-aggression pact, he had no, even a very limited field of maneuver. No move of this would change the way of the inevitable partition of Polish state. After 23rd of August, under the impact of the news of Hitler-Stalin understanding, only the Western powers could modify their course. They took in the spring in 1939, but Poland has no such a possibility. This should be recorded again. The basic assumption of Polish leadership was the conviction that there was no possibility of a permanent improvement of relations between Berlin and Moscow. At the same time, a conviction prevailed in Warsaw that Stalin would not appear as an ally of the Reich in the face of an anti-German coalition, including Poland and the Western powers, which would be effective in its military operations. Such chances were created by the Polish-British alliance concluded officially on 25 of August 39, which put the German Reich in the face of an eventuality of war on two fronts. But this was a possibility that the general staffs of the elite countries, especially France, did not know how to take advantage of. Of course, Warsaw knew nothing of the top secret resolutions of the general staffs of France and Britain in April 39, which said that in case of defeat, Poland would be restored to Poland. Poland would be restored after the victorious end of European war. And the result of Polish campaign is of secondary importance. The Polish leadership was convinced that the clear position of Great Britain, as it was assessed in that time, assured ipso facto the readiness of France to start military operations in the West. It is true that Minister Beck perceived the downfall of the France and was realistic in his low opinion of the military significance of Poland's alliance with Paris. However, experience showed that England had a decisive say in the defense of the balance of power in Europe, although it would not have effective land forces at its disposal at the first stage of war on the continent. What France lacked in the defense of the status quo through the 20 years of peace was precisely the support of London. Now, after Poland received its guarantees, later transformed into a bilateral alliance, her international situation, underwent essential change. Therefore, Joseph Beck was justified in noting down that the road to Paris leads through London. And what is more, in the summer 39, he came to the conviction that Polish diplomacy successfully reached the end of this difficult road. But this was not enough to avoid the defeat. It is still very difficult to form an objective opinion of Joseph Beck and his position in the history of Poland. He still awaits a reliable and exhaustive political biography. It is quite understandable and natural that in post-war Poland, people's Poland, there was a tendency to present him in the most negative light as possible. The results of Polish policy between 1934 and 1939 will certainly remain to be the subject of historiographical disputes for many other years to come. Marian Wojciechowski, a historian of Polish-German relations, wrote that Nazi Germany, whose real character was not clear to Beck. However, we must remind that in Europe of the end of 30s, there was no conscious of the real character of Nazism and Nazi Germany. Not only to Beck, these questions were difficult to resolve. Hitler's policy was wrongly interpreted in the first place by the leaders of Western powers, hence their policy of appeasement, and also by Stalin and Soviet leadership. Ambassador Kajetan Morawski wrote that, I'm citing, Beck was certainly right in trying to maintain the line of Polish policy in a difficult balance between the onrush of our eastern and western neighbors, perhaps even not so much right as presented with no options. One may only regret that he endowed his solicitude for his full independence of action with the traits of a haughty gesture. His mistake, however, didn't relate to the essence of our foreign policy, but its presentation to our partners. He approached the tasks he faced with great intelligence, but also with a sense of bygone wrongs and with self-confidence that surpassed his experience. Poland had no alternative to the policy it conducted in 30 years. She could not rely at that time on a close cooperation with the rapidly weakening France, which was undergoing an internal crisis. On the other hand, collective security was not possible, although many empty phrases had been said on this subject. For this reason, we may criticize the tactics applied by Beck. Certainly, he was not the model of diplomat to be followed. He committed many mistakes, but there was no alternative to his principal orientation he chose. This orientation was policy of balance. The political accomplishment of Józef Beck must be critically assessed. However, this assessment must correspond with the socio-moral scheme of the era to which it relates, as was rightly observed by Henryk Wojciechowski, Polish distinguished historian of diplomacy. Otherwise, any assessment of any historical personage will be non-historical and we should not forget, Wojciechowski wrote, that not every lost cause is bad, since not always a good cause may be victorious. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Koronat. Well, with that essentially positive reading of Mr. Beck's foreign policy, we move from the problematical 1920s through the lugubrious 1930s, but things are now going to get worse because we now turn to the Second World War and Professor Anna Ciechala.
I wonder if we could get this up. Okay. Now, the foreign policy of the Polish government in exile is what I'm going to talk about. It is generally considered to be part of the Second Republic. There was a continuity of government, as I'm sure some of you may know. Under the 1935 Constitution, the President of Poland had the right to nominate his successor, and he did so. President Mościcki in Romania first nominated Wieniawa Długoszowski, who was rejected by the French government. He then nominated Władysław Raczkiewicz as president of Poland, and then General Sikorski Władysław Sikorski became prime minister and also commander-in-chief a little later. And the first Polish government in exile was in France. And yeah, we can keep that up there. And then in London after the collapse of France. Now, as you may know, the Germans and the Soviets attacked Poland, and the Germans on the 1st of September and the Soviets on the 17th. And this was the consequence of the secret protocol to the German-Soviet non-aggression pact of August 23rd. Would you show the next one, the grinning people in the Kremlin office? Ribbentrop and Stalin shaking hands, I think, or about to, and Shaposhnikov, the head of the Soviet General Staff, in the middle. And this was on August 23rd, and this is when they agreed on the first Ribbentrop-Molotov line, which is generally forgotten. Would you show us the next one? It was shown a demarcation line. What is this? Oh yes, this is a David Low cartoon in England, which is rather explicit, I think. Stalin and Hitler greeting each other. Later on, David Low became rather anti-Polish, but at this point sympathized with Poland. Okay, now the next thing is to show you the first demarcation line. No, not that one, I'm sorry, that's just the text, I forgot to take it out. It's Pravda, it should be Pravda of September 23rd, right?
Yes.
Of course, it didn't refer to the secret protocol, which was secret and was denied by all Soviet governments until April, I think, 1989, December 1989, I think it was finally acknowledged, and even condemned by the Supreme Soviet, which was the first freely elected one. This says a demarcation line between German and Soviet armies in Poland. You see, it goes right down the middle through Warsaw, along the Vistula, Narew, and San. Pisa River was added later. And then there was a second one, a treaty which established the frontier, but that was September 28th in Moscow, and this is known as the Ribbentrop-Molotov line. And here Pravda shows it as the frontier between German and Soviet state interests. Well, what was the main problem, the main task of the Polish government? It was to restore the state of Poland as an independent Poland within its pre-war frontiers, however, with at first possible and then later certainly demanded acquisitions of German territory. You could show the next transparency, which shows Poland, the Curzon line, which was the main problem in relations. See, this is the Polish one, I think. Polish legend, yeah. Oh no, that's Davis. When, after Germany attacked the Soviet Union on June 22nd, the Soviet Union automatically became an ally of the anti-German coalition, and very quickly made it quite clear that they wanted, as a price of their engagement in the war, in their part of the war, to keep the territories they had gained in 1939. And Stalin was clever enough to modify this demand to say, what we want is simply the Curzon line with a few modifications. But before I come to that, yeah, I think I ought to mention the Polish-Soviet agreement to restore relations, which was signed in London by General Sikorski on the one hand, and Soviet Ambassador Ivan Maisky on the other. And this restored relations, which obviously had been broken in 1939 by the Soviet attack on Poland. Before this was signed, the Soviet demand was an ethnic Poland, which really meant the Poland up to the Bug and Vistula and San line, which had been traced in 1939. But Sikorski managed, with the help of Anthony Eden, Foreign Secretary of Britain, to provide a compromise formula. And in the agreement of July 30th, known as the Sikorski-Maisky Pact, the Soviet government said it recognized the territorial arrangements in 1939 as no longer valid. As no longer valid. So it didn't come out and say we recognize the pre-war frontier, but we recognize that our partition of Poland with Germany is no longer valid. Now that wasn't enough for some ministers. 3 ministers of the Polish government resigned. I would like to show the transparency of Poland as it was in 39-41. I think that's the... No, that's the one after that, I'm sorry. So that you would have... No, that's an... Okay, that's fine. One of the arguments in favor of the Soviet demand for an ethnic Poland, which was dropped in 39-41 but was revived later, was the ethnic composition of Eastern Poland. This is a map which is obviously not very detailed, but it does show you that the Poles were a minority in Eastern Poland overall, although they had regional majorities which are marked in dark colors. Obviously, if self-determination had been really followed in the interwar period, you would have had some kind of Belarusian and Ukrainian states, maybe autonomous, but political circumstances did not allow for that. There was a lot of discrimination against Belarusians and Ukrainians in Poland, that's quite true, but you must also bear in mind that things were far worse for them in the USSR. 7 to 10 million Ukrainians perished in the man-made famine Stalin used to break resistance to collectivization. 7 to 10 million people, Ukrainians, and then of course also Belarusians. So in a comparative sense, yes, there was discrimination against Ukrainians and Belarusians, but it was a matter of death for millions of them in the Soviet Union. So that has to be borne in mind. But the other argument which you often come across even today is that after all, Soviet security demanded that it keep its 1941 frontiers. It was an argument very often made. It was even made by, of course, by Soviet propaganda and by British and American writers that Russia had been invaded twice in the 20th century, 1914, when it was actually in Poland attacked by the Germans and Austro-Hungarians. But the famous Curzon line, which you do see here, goes back to roughly 1920, although it had been proposed earlier in 1919 as a demarcation line between Polish and Russian administrations. In July 1920, when Red Army was coming up to Warsaw, there was a Polish delegation at Spa in Belgium, where the French and British and I think Italians maybe were meeting to discuss German reparations. And an armistice line was worked out. The armistice line was called the Curzon line after Lord Nathaniel Curzon, who was the British Foreign Secretary of the time and who had nothing to do with it because his experience was as Viceroy of India. But it was based mainly on the Russian frontier, eastern frontier of Russian Poland, 1914, but then it was extended into what was then called East Galicia, Małopolska Wschodnia, West Ukraine. And the Poles were tricked there, because the Polish delegation signed an armistice line in East Galicia along the existing front line, which was far west of the Curzon line. So someone in the British Foreign Office made that line, the far west line, the Curzon line. And what is also not very often known is that the Soviet government actually rejected the Curzon line and said, we want to negotiate with the Poles. And what they meant, of course, negotiate while advancing on Warsaw. And then, of course, the Reds were defeated, which is another thing that is often simply not mentioned in our textbooks, university textbooks. And recent discovery in Poland was that at that time, Polish cryptographers had broken the Red Army ciphers, and so Piłsudski knew exactly where the Soviet units were, which helped him a great deal, although it was still taking a risk, making a counter-offensive in the middle of August against them. And also Polish cryptographers could get on the same wavelength as the Tukhachevsky orders to his Red Army units, and they were blocking these orders by reading the first word of the New Testament Bible again and again and again. So that doesn't detract from Piłsudski's genius, as some Polish journalists have contended. But anyhow, the Curzon line was the line that was very much, I would say, favored by the British government in 1939. In the alliance that was signed on August 25th, there was no guarantee of Polish frontiers but of independence. There was a guarantee of help against the Germans and any other alien nations, but not the Soviet Union. Because the British were always thinking of how can we get Stalin over to our side. And the bargaining counter was Eastern Poland from the very beginning, which is an idea that the Poles, of course, did not share. Now, going back to the Sikorsky-Maysky Pact, this began a period of really fairly good relations between the Soviet authorities, or really Stalin, and the Polish government in London. A Polish army was raised in the Soviet Union from many prisoners of war. Different figures are given, 400,000, 300,000 maybe taken by the Red Army in September 39. A lot of these rank and file were let go home practically immediately. But probably about 10,000 officers, maybe 6,500 police, and various other people were taken to the Soviet Union to 3 special camps, as you know, in Kozielsk, Ostashkov, and Starobielsk. And their location became known when they began to write to their families. They were allowed to write from the end of November, early December 1939 to the end of March 1940. So the Polish government knew that they existed, these people, all these people. And then suddenly all contact broke off. And so when the Polish army was being formed in the USSR, the Polish authorities kept on asking, where are these people? Where are these people? And we have all kinds of documents on that. And the Soviet answer was always they were all released. In one instance, when Stalin was speaking to Sikorsky in December 1941, when Sikorsky was in Moscow, the Germans were in the suburbs of Moscow by that time, and they were not thrown back till the 7th, 8th of December by Zhukov, so Sikorsky was taking a big risk. But in that conversation, which we have Polish and Russian records, Sikorsky again asked, where are these officers? And Stalin said, as far as I know, they have all been released, but maybe some of them escaped to Manchuria. Now that was black humor, you know. Where is Starobielsk and Ostashkov and Kozelsk and Manchuria at the other end? So what happened, of course, you know, is that the Germans discovered the Katyn graves. This was absolutely this one site. We didn't know about the others until 1990. And the German army was near Smolensk in western Russia and discovered, and Goebbels decided to make it a big propaganda issue to try and split the Allies. The Polish government had to do something. Most of the army that had gotten out of Russia with General Anders in 1942, went to the Middle East and then fought in Italy, they came from these territories. So there was outrage. And it was clear to anybody from the evidence that these were people who were massacred in 1940, before the German-Soviet war, so that the Germans couldn't have done it. And yet the Soviet government said it's the Germans. The Polish government did what was possible. It turned to the International Red Cross Committee in Geneva and said, would you please conduct an investigation? But the trouble was that the International Red Cross couldn't do it without the acceptance, the agreement of both parties, Germans and Soviets. Soviets refused. And started a propaganda campaign against Poland, that it was collaborating with the Germans, it was a traitor and all that. And so while pressure from the British ally on Poland to think about the post-war frontier without Eastern Poland was there before Katyn, it increased tremendously after that. Winston Churchill, the British used to call him good old Winnie, tried very hard to re-establish Polish-Soviet relations. But he said the condition is you must agree to give up Eastern Poland. And the Polish government could not see its way to do that. And I'll explain why in a minute. The United States stood on the Atlantic Charter, which I'm sure most of you have heard of, was a kind of program of war aims signed by Roosevelt and Churchill in August 1941 on board a battleship. I think it was off Newfoundland somewhere. And among other things, it said that they did not support territorial aggression, and they would not countenance territorial changes during the war, and any changes without consulting the population. Now, this is something that the Poles believed in implicitly. However, President Roosevelt, who had been very effusive to Sikorski and in support of Poland's pre-war frontiers when Sikorski first visited the United States in 1941, he had made 3 visits actually, began to back away from this, and privately he was already talking in 1942 that Stalin might have, Soviets might have Eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia. And this was noted by Adolf Berle, an assistant secretary of state, and it's in his memoirs, Navigating the Rapids. Around, after Stalingrad victory, early February 43, Roosevelt very clearly came over, but still privately, because he didn't want to lose the Polish-American vote, to the idea that Eastern Poland must go to Russia. And then you have the first Quebec conference, which is codenamed Quadrant, August 17 to 24, 1943. And for me, that is the turning point, because the military and political leaders, and Churchill and Roosevelt were there, decided that Eastern Europe was to be the Soviet war theater. No Western troops in Eastern Europe. And from then on, Eastern Europe was seen as in the sphere of Soviet influence, or Soviet sphere of influence. And so what was Churchill to do? He chose the strategy of tremendous pressure. Sikorski, and then when Sikorski was killed in July 43 off Gibraltar, on Mikolajczyk, who was the prime minister after him. Come to an agreement during the war, before the Russians get into Poland. And the Polish government kept on saying, we can't do this without consulting the Poles. And Polish majority opinion was completely against giving up Eastern Poland. You can see this in any number of declarations. Trying to find these. Well, I'll have to do them from memory. You know that at Tehran, Big Three meeting at Tehran, November 28, December 243, Churchill trotted out his proposal to Stalin to move Poland west like a soldier taking 3 steps left close. And he had illustrated it with matches in case Stalin didn't understand. Well, Stalin knew that very well. He had proposed that to Eden in December 41. What did Roosevelt say? Roosevelt said to Stalin that he favored moving Poland west. Didn't say anything about the Curzon line, but obviously it was involved. And as for the Baltic states, he also understood that they would have to be in the Soviet Union, but he would like to have some sort of referendum for the sake of American public opinion. And Stalin said he understood, but there'd be no international observers. And Roosevelt explained, you know, I can't come out in favor of what Churchill said because I have this presidential election coming up next year in November 44. And Stalin understood. Yeah. Now, did the Polish government know about all this? Well, it did and it didn't. When Churchill came back from Tehran, he did talk to Mikolajczyk. He didn't say, this is what we decided at Tehran, but he said, this is what I think is the best solution for you, to agree to give up Eastern Poland, and in return you will get territories from Germany in the north and in the west, without specification. But it meant East Prussia and part of pre-war Germany. And Mikolajczyk said, well, we can't really do this, but we have to consult the country. Well, what did the Council of National Unity, Rada Jedności Narodowej, which was the underground sort of parliament of Poland, very small political leaders, the delegate of the Polish government who was the head there, he said, the council agreed to the proposed western boundaries and the removal of the Germans, but it objected strongly to any discussion with the Soviets regarding the revision of the eastern boundaries. And he said, and I quote, no one in Poland would understand why Poland is to pay the Soviets the costs of war with her territories and independence. So, and this was Polish opinion in Poland and abroad. And not only the people who were in the AK, Armia Krajowa, and other organizations, political organizations underground, and in the political parties in the West, the communists of Poland didn't want to come out for this. The head of the PPR, Polska Partia Robotnicza, communist party in Poland, which didn't call itself communist, Gomulka, wrote to Georgi Dimitrov, who was the former Secretary General of the former Comintern, which was dissolved officially in May of 43, but carried on as a department in the Central Committee of Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Gomulka wrote this: the main problem for us, which prevents us from creating a popular front in Poland or a broad political front, is the question of frontiers. And he said, if St. Anthony's Brotherhood came out in favor of revising the eastern frontier, it would immediately be denounced as a Soviet front organization receiving Soviet money to get the Polish nation under the boot of Stalin. So even if a Catholic organization had come out in favor of revision, it would have been denounced. So that English translation comes from The Beginnings of Communist Rule in Poland, edited by Antony Polonsky and Bolesław Drucker. It came out in London 1980. I had first read it in a habilitacja dissertation in Warsaw in '79, and also thought it was quite remarkable. And then Mikolajczyk was pretty much forced to go to Moscow, at the end of July 1944. While he was on his way there in Cairo, from London, Cairo to Tehran, Moscow, he heard about the proclamation of the Polski Komitet Wyzwolenia Narodowego, the Polish Committee of National Liberation, which was formed in Moscow on July 22nd, I think, became the national holiday. And he continued and tried to come to some understanding with Stalin, also told him there would be an uprising in Warsaw any day. And Stalin said, oh yes, it was Molotov. Molotov said, we're about 8 kilometers from Warsaw. This was, I think, on August 1st or 2nd. And then on August 3rd, he saw Stalin, and Stalin said, yes, well, we expect to take Warsaw soon, but and we will help for the Warsaw Uprising. Would have been giving up Eastern Poland and recognizing the Polish Committee of National Liberation as at least the core, if not the Polish government. Polish opinion wouldn't do that. Even in the midst of the fighting in Warsaw, when the Polish leadership of the army and the civilian administration was told about a compromise proposal by the Polish government in London that after the war Poland should retain its chief cultural centers in the east and the absolutely necessary sources, natural resources, which meant keeping Vilna, or Vilnius, capital of Lithuania now, it was preponderantly Polish then, and Lvov in the southeast, which was preponderantly Polish before the war. Poles were absolutely wedded to keeping at least Vilna and Lvov, and the oil fields, that's the natural, which are in the Lvov region. So when Bor Komorowski and the delegate of the Polish government received this Polish government in London proposal compromise, we will agree to give up most of Eastern Poland, not so many words, except for Vilna and Lvov and the oil fields, although the frontiers will be fixed after the war. The reaction was, this is a complete surrender, and the Poles have not fought the Germans for 5 years for the sake of an eventual surrender to Russia. So, very briefly, and I know I've gone over my time a little bit, no Polish government could accept these conditions in wartime without committing political suicide. And we don't know what would have happened if it had agreed. Probably a complete breakdown of the resistance movement. Why go on resisting the Germans if this is what's going to happen to us after the war? Now, you know that Mikolajczyk resigned, finally came to the conclusion after a second trip to Moscow and coming back and failing to get the Polish government to agree to some sort of cession of Eastern Poland. He decided that, never mind, we have to make an agreement with the Russians, and he believed that his party, the Peasant Party, the largest party in Poland, would win free elections. And these free elections were guaranteed in the Yalta Agreements, February 11, 1945, which also said that the Polish eastern border would be the Curzon Line, and in the west there would be acquisition of territory and so on. Well, as you know, there were no free elections. The one thing that Poland did get out of the war was the frontier in the west, and we don't need any more of these, which was a temporary frontier. Most of part of East Germany went to Poland and East Prussia. And this temporary frontier lasted until October 1990, when it was officially recognized, the unification of Germany. But in conclusion, I would like to suggest that we do bear in mind that the Polish government, several reconstructed government too, Polish underground, majority opinion, simply would not agree to give up Eastern Poland. And this they didn't agree to, most of them, until after the Russian army got in, and obviously you couldn't do anything about it. So historians writing about this, who condemn the Poles as romantics, as unrealistic, as living in cloud cuckoo land and all that, they have to remember this was a democratic government which listened to its public opinion. As for Roosevelt, I'm sorry to say, he stated to Ambassador Harriman in May of 1944, according to Harriman papers, "I don't care if the neighboring states neighboring on Russia are communized. I don't care." His main goal was to keep the Russians in the war, win the war in Europe, and then have Soviet aid against Japan. Otherwise, Americans would lose 2 million men, and it would take an awfully long time. So in this sense, Churchill was trying hard to keep some sort of balance in Europe. He wanted the American troops to stay where they were in Germany instead of retiring to their occupation zones as agreed at Yalta. All he got actually was independent Greece. I don't know that. But no Polish government could have bowed to this. And the British Americans, especially Americans, considered Eastern Poland and the Baltic states and Bessarabia, northeast Romania, as expendable. And why? Because they did not consider their vital interests were engaged in Central and Southeastern Europe. And so, as one of the Polish newspapers, underground papers, wrote in March 44 after Churchill's speech at Parliament, in which he proposed the cession of Eastern Poland in return for German territory, they said, "We don't want a Russian Munich." And so it was impossible, I would say, for any Polish government during the war to accept this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ciancialo, for allowing me to demonstrate my technical virtuosity in running those slides. I'll make my remarks extremely short so we have some time for questions. And the first thing that strikes me is, in any consideration of the foreign policy of the Second Republic, a foreign policy which ends with the invasion of the country by its two neighbors, the destruction of the state and the occupation of the entire national territory, can hardly be adjudged a success. As a consequence of that, one is forced to consider what are the problems that inhibited Polish foreign policy in the 20 years preceding the invasion. And it seems a tripartite division might be in order. And that is, when analyzing the successes and failures of the foreign policy of the Second Republic, to what degree can we attribute those successes and failures, first of all, to what we might call structural features in the international system, the preferences, predilections of the major powers and their interrelationships. The second is, to what degree can we attribute the successes and failures to intrinsic Polish limitations, demographic, economic, military, and to what degree can we attribute them to the specific failings of individual makers of Polish foreign policy. And so the one question I would ask all of our three panelists to consider is how they would apportion the blame for the fact that at the end, in 1939, Poland found itself, found its foreign policy in ruins. What I'll do is I'll ask that one large question rather than the several smaller ones I have in mind, only in the interest of time, and ask in chronological order of those who spoke to respond to that question, and once they have the floor, if they would like to respond to the points raised by their colleagues' speeches, they may do that as well. After having given each of our three presenters, therefore, an opportunity to speak, I'll then throw open the floor to questions and follow the suggestions of Mr. Snyder earlier that each questioner identify himself before asking a question, and please make sure that it is a question. Professor Vandic?
Well, I think that it's quite a legitimate question to say, well, Polish foreign policy did not prevent the collapse in 1939, the partition of the country, and so forth. Obviously, we have to start with the statement that interwar Poland was not a great power. But as a French historian, Louis Eisenman put it very well, I'm translating mentally from French, it has been ça a été un malheur pour la Pologne de renaître comme un État qui n'était pas une puissance, mais qui ne pouvait pas se réconcilier à être traité comme un État inférieur. It was Poland's misfortune that it was not reborn as a great power and could not reconcile itself to the position of a small state. In a sense, this, plus the fact that Poland placed between two great neighbors, which were inimical from the beginning, could not conduct a foreign policy on its own which could avert the catastrophe. So I think that in a sense, if we look at it from a historical perspective, the Polish foreign policy in the interwar period is that of attempting to square a circle. There was no possibility acting on its own to achieve a position which would have prevented a German-Soviet rapprochement and again collusion against Poland if the two decided. So the diplomacy, as I put it, did not have any aces. It could play with small cards, and the question is how well were these cards played. Personally, I feel that in the case of the 20s, and this was considered to some extent the early 30s, the reliance was on the collective security, League of Nations, and hopes that the Franco-British rivalry, which in a sense was one of the great misfortunes because the League of Nations relied on these two powers. The League of Nations, as a diplomat put it, was not it was they. Once France and Britain pursued different policies, and each of them tried to associate Germany to its policies, obviously the League of Nations could not succeed. Nonetheless, I don't see what else Poland could have done in the 20s except to try to reinforce the League of Nations, reinforce security. In the 30s, again, I think that the change which Piłsudski expressed so well, I think, speaking of the two canons, and then at the conference for the leaders of his party in 1934, when he said that obviously we cannot guarantee agreement with Germany for more than 4 years. And I think that this is, in a sense, the key. The Polish-German non-aggression declaration is the key to the Polish foreign policy in the 30s. Was it a major achievement? Was it a mistake? Obviously, it had to be paid for, which I don't think the Poles fully realized, by a weakening of the relation with France. In a sense, and I think General Sosnkowski put it once, trying to understand what was the real purpose of the non-aggression pact was to signal, Warsaw wanted to signal, if he thought so, to Paris that the Poles could make an arrangement with Germany on their own. Therefore, they were not a burden to France. They were a partner with whom France had to reckon. This, I think, was a mistaken opinion. Nonetheless, the pact did delay the confrontation with Germany. The famous remark attributed to one of the Polish statesmen as all nice remarks, is probably apocryphal, that the German-Polish agreement relegated from Poland, from the German menu, from the hors d'oeuvre to the dessert. And many things can happen between these two things. So in that sense, playing for time. As for the Second World War, I think the only chance which Poland had theoretically, the Polish government, which again was a poor relative, which again was not a full partner of Britain and America or Russia. The only chance was to persuade Britain and the United States that Soviet control of Central Europe was a danger to them. But this was, in the conditions of the Second World War, a pretty hopeless position. And it only made Poland appear in the eyes of the British and the Americans as a country which has not forgotten anything, which has not learned anything, which does not want to accept the new realities. Other than that, again, I see. So in a sense, my point of view, commenting on these three papers, is a very pessimistic one. The fate of Poland, in a sense, was preordained, and obviously one can add a number of reasons, a number of elements which made it more difficult. Personality problems, especially of Beck, the public opinion in Poland, which did not always operate in a way which would assist the foreign minister in carrying out his duties, conveying a wrong or a negative image of Poland abroad, etc. So one can agree with all of that, but still I don't think that the essence would not have been changed, whatever had been done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Coronado, chance to respond, please.
I think that the most important achievement of Minister Beck in 1939 was the internalization of Polish affair. He turned Polish cause into the international arena, and I think this was the maximum of what may be done in this situation. And Polish diplomacy has no possibilities to gain real support of Western powers and the execution of the obligations of Western powers to Poland. And as I have mentioned in my statement, Polish policy has no remedium for to prevent the cooperation of Russia and Germany. However, we can retrospectively consider the possibility of cooperation with Germany on the basis of German proposals from October 1938. It must be reminded here that the German government proposed the return of Free City of Danzig to Germany and to construct a territorial highway across the so-called Polish corridor. We have the documents that in Polish Foreign Ministry there were considered different possibilities of constructing such a highway, but without the clause of exterritoriality. And the demands of Hitler were simple, and Hitler wanted necessarily the exterritoriality. And in such a constellation, the acceptance of German proposals was for Poland impossible. Polish policy couldn't avoid the situation which was in summer 1939, and it was impossible to do nothing more than was done by Beck. I mean about internalization of Polish question. We must remember that Polish question was in 1939 connected with the general question of peace so closely that never before, and probably never later. It was a maximum of what Beck achieved.
Thank you very much. Professor Cianciolo.
Well, I don't think I have any quarrel with Professor Vandic, he said. I would simply like just to add that what I said, that I gave as a talk, was very general. I have a lot more detail which I couldn't possibly include. Maybe this will be published, maybe not. But I would like to underline the fact that although Poland today is in the best situation it has been for maybe 400 years or more, there are still circles in the United States which feel that the most important, and say so, the most important thing for the United States is to have good relations with Russia. I mean, aside from Iraq, which is a problem. President Bush did apologize for the Yalta agreements, which was very nice of him, but he tied it to the Middle East, his democracy slogan there, which I think was probably important for him and then of course he would have to explain to American public opinion why he was going to Moscow with this big military parade, and then afterwards he and Putin drove around in Putin's 1950s Volga, you know. Maybe they had some vodka as well. But there is a danger. We're not out of the woods. Poland is still between Germany and Russia, even though there's Belarus and Ukraine. And thank goodness for the Ukraine. And I hope it manages to stay independent in spite of the tremendous economic pressure by Russia for political needs, oil and gas supplies to Ukraine. There is a worrisome thing for me, and I'm sure other people, and there is this gas line from Viborg, I think, along the bottom of the Baltic Sea to Germany, and that is far more expensive to build than overland Poland and Lithuania, so it's definitely political. It's probably an exaggeration to call it a new German-Soviet pact, or new German-Russian pact, as not a Polish but a Russian commentator wrote in the Kommersant after the news came out. But it is worrisome, and it's certainly in everybody's interest to try and reduce our dependence on oil and gas by developing other means. Thank you.
Oh, not even lunch, we still already have more problems. Do we have time for questions? Please keep your questions brief, and please identify yourself. Questions, please. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I have several questions. I'm sorry.
Pick one, please.
Yeah, just one? Well, I will try to come back. First of all, the simple questions to Professor Cianciolo. If you can comment about the Curzon line, because the famous Curzon had nothing to do with Eastern Europe, apparently, in his professional life. So why is he creating such an important concept? And also, regarding Wolf, well, I skipped this one. Then the second question is maybe to Professor Vandic. Regarding your conclusion that there was no option. I would like you to speculate, if I may ask you, about what would happen if Poland would join the collective security arrangements with Great Britain and Russia in 1939. Whether that would give us any chance. Okay, and I guess the third component of my question would be that your comment that the United States and Great Britain should recognize the importance of Eastern Europe. That was the only chance for us. I'm wondering, first of all, whether they would recognize that today. And the second is whether you would agree that the Cold War really originated from that mistake that America and Great Britain made towards Eastern Europe. Thank you.
Why was Curzon's name attached? Was simply because he was the foreign secretary and had to sign it.
And the competence and the expertise?
No, it's not. No, it was prepared by British diplomats, advisors, etc., who were with him at Spa, and he just signed it, agreed with it. But as I mentioned, the Curzon line in East Galicia differed from the line that the Polish delegation had agreed to, which was the front line at the time, which was east, way east of Lvov. So Lord Curzon was simply the foreign minister who signed the proposal, and that's all I can tell you. I'm sure he didn't disagree, but he was no expert.
Thank you. Professor Vandrich, you want to respond?
Well, since we have very little time, let me take refuge in a saying of Professor Vereshitsky, which I rather like. He wrote that historians have hard enough time to explain what happened, not to bother about what did not happen.
Yes, sir, right there.
About Cold War.
Sorry, it is not a question. It is, I like turn your attention for important message going from Second Republic to us, to Poles to citizens of Third or Fourth Republic, to Poles of 21st century. Sorry, I forgot to present myself. Jerzy Rudykowski, former Consul General, now temporary visitor, to visit both my son here. One of them is with me, the first graduate of political science too. Yeah, this message, this should be very good understood by contemporary Poles. This lesson should be clear. Solidarity revolution and political changes in Europe gone in 1988 to 1991 create completely new situation. But this message is our policy of reconciliation with Germany, our policy to be a member of United Europe, to be a member of European Union, should be dogma of our foreign policy. Should be never be questioned. I like to say a bit more. Be a member of the leading group of strong European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Question? Yes, ma'am.
My name is Maria Rashid, and I am just would like to say to Professor Chinchilla that
Write it down because I can't hear. Could you speak louder, because I have problems with hearing too.
I would like to speak to Professor Chinchilla that the question of Curzon line is very well described in the second volume of Professor Jędrzejewicz book, which was the
Poland in the British Parliament. Yes.
Poland in British Parliament.
Yes, yes.
In there he describes in the annex, the Professor Malinowski, I believe, was the name of who wrote that an appendix to that volume about the mistake that was seen as done at the British diplomatic offices about the line, and that it was proposed to be corrected, but because of the signing by the conference of ambassadors happened about the same time, it was precluded that nothing can be done about it.
Yes, well, there was an article written by Swarakowski on the Curzon line, but I forget where it was published.
General Central European Affairs.
It went, what year was it?
1964.
Yeah, that was a very good exposition of it too.
Thank you. Brief questions. Yes, sir.
To my knowledge, Soviets, they executed not 10,000, but more than 20,000 Polish officers. That's one correction.
I'm sorry, you're not right.
Second is the policemen, Polish policemen in 39.
Yes.
They were shot on the spot.
Yeah.
We don't have a good records about the Polish policemen. This is one point. The second point, the Iron Curtain was drawn in Yalta. The third point, Gomulka came to power 10 or 15 years after 45. So in 45, he didn't play any role. There was Bierut, Osódka-Morawski, Rzemierski. Gomulka was still on the bottom. He came 15 years later, and
49. In interest of time, gentlemen.
I have to.
49, he became the
Gentlemen.
secretary of the Polish Press.
Please no dialogue in the audience.
Please, I would like just to answer a couple of your points. The total number was well over 20,000. I know they were not all officers. I've just finished editing an English language volume on Katyn, which will come out in Yale University Press. According to Soviet figures, in February 1940, there were 8,500 Polish officers. If you would listen to me, please. According to NKVD records, in February 1940, there were 8,500 Polish officers in the three camps, mainly in Kozielsk and Starobielsk. Over 5,000 of them were reserve officers. According to the same NKVD figures, in February or March 1940, the Ostashkov camp had 6,500 prisoners, of whom 5,000 were ordinary policemen. So I do know that. And as I said while you were talking to this gentleman, you will find all this in the volume, English language volume of Katyn documents, which I have just edited, will come out in Yale University Press next year. Now, as for Gomulka, he was, in 1944, he was the leader of the PPR in Poland. And so he represented his opinion and the leadership at that time. I forget what the third point was.
Thank you very much. Our chairman has signaled me that our time is up. I'd like to thank our speakers and you, ladies and gentlemen, in the audience. Thank you.